papers. As I said in my opening address at the beginning of the conference, this was gold for our conference. It generated a lot of interest in our core subject matter. It happened far enough away from the conference to be of benefit and close enough to the conference for it to be newsworthy. And the first person I called to see if he would participate, and he agreed pretty much immediately. I'd known him for a while. He spoke at our event last year. GERARD RYLE, the head of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And he's going to be speaking with Art VANDESANDE, who I've known for, 15 plus years, probably 16 plus years. The first major expose OffshoreAlert had was of an American CPA based in Panama called Mark Harris. And Art is a recently retired criminal IRS investigator, agent. He's recently gone into private practice, but Art, while with the IRS, investigated Mr. Harris, and obviously successfully, because Mr. Harris is currently serving 17 years in prison. So they're going to present a session that's quite polarizing on the Panama Papers. Some people are in favor of it vehemently, and some people don't like it at all, equally vehemently. So I'll turn you over.
See if I can get this working. Hi, thanks for having me. I know that some of you probably don't agree with what we do, but I thought it'd be useful to walk you through our process and everything we do. Okay, so the first question is, what is the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists? We're a non-profit journalist organization based in Washington, D.C. We're part of an organization called the Center for Public Integrity. And we actually focus on international and global stories, whereas the center focuses on the US, basically. We're 200 journalists. It's a member organization. We invite investigative reporters from around the world to work with us. We make them members when we like them. But increasingly in the last couple of years, we've become an international consortium of media partners, big and small, from the smallest non-profits around the world to the biggest media organizations in the world. We've got 12 staff. We're, as I said, totally non-profit. We rely on donations to keep going, and often the reason I agree to these kind of events is that I need people to know that we actually need money to do this. We're very much a shoestring operation. And what we've done is we basically realized that 12 people can't do very much, so if we can convince major media organizations to get involved in stories, and then they put their resources and their reporters to the story, we get a much better result. And over the last 4 years, we've really taken this to new heights and changed, I guess in some ways, we're actually changing journalism. Now, this audience, you might remember us. Let's see if I can get that working. Let's go again. All right, sorry. You might remember us from 2013. We published a series of stories called Secrecy for Sale, which became known as Offshore Leaks. That led to another China leaks, essentially, which was basically we revealed the offshore holdings of the Chinese elite, and that was in early 2014. At the end of 2014, we got a hold of a bunch of secret documents from PricewaterhouseCoopers in Luxembourg that showed how major corporations around the world were actually paying very low rates of tax using Luxembourg. There's a court case going on at the moment where 3 people are facing jail as a result of this, one of them being the journalist, one of the journalists we worked with. And then this time last year, I was here talking about Swiss leaks, which was essentially the internal information we managed to get a hold of via a source in the French government on HSBC. All of these stories had huge ramifications around the world, and I would say that basically the Panama Papers came from that, essentially, because what we've been doing is working with major media organizations who are increasingly coming to us with big stories. The Luxembourg material came via the BBC, a source in the BBC. Le Monde in France were the source for the HSBC material. And in this case, we actually had been working with Süddeutsche Zeitung in each of these stories. And these two guys here, the guy that I'm seeing on your left is Bastian Obermeier, and the guy on the right is Frederick Obermeier. They're not brothers. They actually spell their surnames differently. Bastian, the guy on the left, was contacted by an anonymous source about a year ago, offering data on Mossack Fonseca. Initially, it was we thought a small amount of material, about 3 million files. And Bastian basically contacted me next, and I flew to Munich. I spent about 4 days in Munich. The three of us went through the files, and at the end of the third day, we then approached the Süddeutsche Zeitung editor and proposed that we do this as an international collaboration. And that's really where it all began. I finished working in Munich, and I then flew to London, where I contacted the BBC and the Guardian newspaper, signed them up for the collaboration, and went on from there, basically. Over time, the material grew. It grew to eventually we had 11.5 million documents from Mossack Fonseca. Pretty much every email, every detail, every client for 40 years going back. And in the data itself went right up to the end of 2015. So as we were working, we were getting more and more data from the anonymous source who was sending the material to Germany, and then we were getting the material from Germany. If you want to compare it to previous leaks, I mean, you see the top one there, 1.7 gigabytes means nothing to most people, but it's a lot of data, and that was the WikiLeaks stuff. Our offshore leaks material in 2013, you can see, is quite large. Luxembourg leaks, and then, you know, pretty much Panama. So inside the data, we're looking at about 5 million emails, so pretty much every email going back and forth between the clients and Mossack Fonseca. PDFs, about 2 million of them. Images would be things like passports and things. So if you were a client, you would have your passport scanned and used, and we were able to access that. That was very useful for journalists, of course, because you were able to identify who these people really were. And you were also able to do searches on, say, every Canadian citizen or every Irish citizen or every American citizen. So our initial challenge as journalists was, how do we make all of this material readable? And even using the best computers, we figured that, you know, if you're able to index one file every 10 seconds, it would take you a year. So our data people got together, and we came up with a solution. We basically put everything on the cloud, and we used 35 virtual machines, and we got the first 3 million documents indexed in 11 days, and went on from there, essentially. That was the... Now, our next thing was obviously to build an international collaboration of journalists. So, as you can imagine, it was very difficult because the ICIJ does not give any instructions to the media partners as to what to find. We basically rely on them to do the research. We then do the global story while they do the story that is relevant to their own countries. But it requires an awful lot of coordination, and that's really part of our job. How do we pick our partners? Well, some of them we've worked with before. Mainly, it's built on trust. If we like working with them, and we know that they're good partners, we basically go back to them again. And a second and very important thing, and this is really only for journalists. Journalists are very egotistical. And so what we ask every journalist who works with us to basically leave that ego at the door and not to get it in the way. Because what we don't want to happen, if we give them access to this material, is for them to go ahead and publish a story without waiting for everybody else. Inside the documents, basically, after we'd managed to index the 11.5 million documents, we made it searchable. So we kept it on a cloud, and it was very important that every journalist could see every document, because we didn't want anyone accusing us of censoring the material. So we basically built a customized tool for this, which we put all the documents into a searchable format, and you could, as a journalist, download any document you wanted, search any document you wanted from your laptop. So we basically had passwords and things that you needed to use, but we put everything up on the cloud, and we basically put it through the internet into every newsroom we were working with. The second thing we built was a global newsroom. So every reporter who worked on the project would go into their physical newsroom, and would also ask them to log on to what we call the global iHub. And there, it was a bit like Facebook for journalists. You could share your findings. So if you were interested in a particular country or a particular topic, you could build a Facebook page for it. You could also see who was live at any one time, so you could communicate securely with your fellow reporters. But also, like, as a journalist, when you discover something, you want to tell somebody. And we were working in secret. So this was our outlet. They could tell their fellow reporters what they were finding. And that basically stopped them telling their girlfriends and their wives and their husbands and everyone else. This is also very important for us because when you're dealing with anonymous material like this, it's very important for journalists to go outside and to really prove public interest. And so what we were very keen to do with all the journalists is make sure that they weren't just relying on the documents. We needed them to go outside the documents. So if there was a company in Bermuda, for instance, that they were interested in, we went to the Bermuda register, or we went to whatever register was relevant to make sure that company was real. We tried to find if there was a court case, for instance, related to that. We would get the documents from the court case, and we put them up on the virtual newsroom. So every reporter, and in the end there were 370 reporters working with us on this, every time they had something relevant for everyone, they put it up on the virtual newsroom, and you as a reporter basically had access to that research. Third tool we built was this called Linkurious, which is basically a nodal database where we put every name, every address, and say a company, and we basically turned it into nodes. I mean, this, what you're looking at here is actually the company, yes, it's a company that belonged to the Icelandic Prime Minister. And you can see it was registered in Luxembourg. You could find the company was called Wintris Inc. And then the two people, left and right, are basically the Prime Minister and his wife. And then that's the address in Iceland. And this was a very important research tool for the journalists because you could go from A to Z, and you knew that you can go from A to Z, and then afterwards you can go through the documents and work your way backwards to prove what you wanted to prove. It was also very useful for us afterwards when we came to publish because basically what you're seeing here is the same thing. So when we published the power players graphics that we were using, and these were all the leaders and their families around the world. We focus a lot on politicians. You can see again on the right-hand side, that's the same, much more complicated structure here for, I think, one of the leaders from the UAE. It also allowed us to do these kind of things afterwards, where we're able to tell you how many companies Mossack Fonseca had been registering over the years. That's the graphic on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, they're intermediaries. You can see that most of their intermediaries were in Hong Kong. Interestingly enough, I think the United States was actually the fourth largest number of intermediaries. Of course, in the end, we do journalism. So we all agreed that we would publish on the same day at the same time. And that was on April the 3rd. That's on the left-hand side, the Guardian newspapers, the Deutsche Zeitung in Germany, Trouw in Netherlands, and of course the Miami Herald here. They were all our partners. Our main findings, which I'm sure you're all aware of, so we'll quickly go through it. Basically, we focus a lot on politicians. We found about 140 politicians, 12 current and former world leaders. We found a lot of companies that have been blacklisted by the US. Basically, these were companies, I think 33 of them, either individuals or companies that were on the sanctions list, and they were doing business with Mossack Fonseca. In some cases, Mossack Fonseca didn't even know who they were doing business with until they appeared on the sanctions list, which we thought was interesting. Let me just keep going. One thing we didn't really focus on, but basically came out of the data, was that there were about 500 banks. As far as Mossack Fonseca were concerned, the end user wasn't their client. It was actually the big banks and accountancy firms, which we thought was interesting. Now, these stories had massive impact around the world. What you're seeing here is the day after we published. That building in the middle is the Icelandic Parliament. And everything you're seeing there are people surrounding it. It was 22,000 people protested the following day, and within about 24 hours, the Icelandic Prime Minister had resigned. We also had resignations in other places like Spain, and David Cameron in Britain was under enormous pressure for about a week over this, because it turned out his father, David Cameron had been campaigning against tax havens, and yet his father actually he inherited offshore companies from his father, essentially. And then, of course, there was the fallout from Russia. Before we'd even published, the Kremlin had held a press conference condemning us because they thought at that stage it was all about them. Putin thought it was just about him, and it wasn't. But he was very happy afterwards when the leader of Ukraine, for instance, popped up, and other politicians around the world. There were several high-profile raids, one of FIFA. Basically, this is one of my favorite stories because it turned out that someone on the FIFA Ethics Committee was actually the lawyer setting up offshore accounts for people that had been indicted by the FBI. And we also had another raid on one of the stories we did was about art, high-end art, and how it was being shipped through offshore companies. And one of the free ports in Switzerland was raided and a masterpiece was seized. This is a story from The Guardian in Britain where basically we solve some mysteries such as who owns high-end property in Britain. A similar story was done here in Miami. We even managed to get a couple of cartel members arrested in Uruguay when it turned out we published the address of where they were staying. Lots of leaders gave press conferences. It became an issue here in the US. Obama gave a press conference where he said that, basically tax avoidance is a big global problem. A lot of it's legal, but that's exactly the problem. So what next for us? Well, in about a week's time, we're going to publish the basic nodal data that you saw, where offshore companies linked to people, linked to addresses. It's something we did 3 years ago with our original Offshore Leaks material. We're going to basically merge that with the original Offshore Leaks database and make it searchable for everyone. We've had millions of hits already on the original Offshore Leaks materials. We imagine that millions more people are going to go there next Monday and probably tell us things that we missed. That's our hope. It's kind of like a crowdsourcing exercise for us. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Everybody get the final score of the match outside? Or are they still out there watching it? The law firms like Fonseca create and maintain corporations, foundations, trusts. When I was over there investigating, the law firms are generally very equal, very common. There's hundreds of law firms there, just like there are in any other financial center, and Panama is a financial center. Some of those corporation foundations and trusts that Fonseca created are jurisdiction to Panama, and some are created outside the country, purchased by the law firm, and then used for some of their clients all over the world, different countries. The creation and annual upkeep of these entities is the main source of income for most of these law firms. They actually either purchase the entity from somewhere, or they already have it on their shelf, the old shelf issue where they would have an older company. A lot of individuals that want to buy entities would like to have an older company. So a lot of these entities are maintained in these law firms for years before they're actually used, and they're required to pay the annual upkeep, the annual fee to the registrar's office in order to keep those updated. Because the history of the firm, sometimes people want an older firm so that if someone were to go and look at it, it would show that it was in place for 3, 5, 8, sometimes 10 years. So it gives it a little bit more validity. So these legal companies either purchase them or create them, and then they maintain them every year. That's a very common practice, and that's where they make a majority of their funds from. That, of course, is completely legal. It's legal there. It's legal in most countries. It's legal right here in the United States. You can create any company, purchase a company, do the annual upkeep, be the registered agent, be the mailing address for the company. All that's fine. That fact alone is done everywhere in every country, especially in the financial centers. So that's not the issue. What you do with those entities, with this law firm or any other law firm, is the key. So you can have a law firm that creates these for their customers and helps you with different schemes, some legal, some illegal, and then you have some law firms that create these entities, give them to you, sell them to you, and then they walk away from the deal after that. So it's up to the individual investigator, the due diligence person, or the litigator to find out what the entities are, who created them, and then whether or not that law firm is still using those entities with their customers. And then you have to determine if those schemes are legal or illegal. In my opinion, there's been a lot of lazy investigations, a lot of lazy journalism in the past couple of years, even the related articles to this gentleman's information that was put out there. You see a lot of lazy journalism where they just say this company exists, this person is tied to it, it's illegal. That's not enough. You got to do better than that, because nobody wants to be accused of something, especially if you're doing something legal, of just saying, I have an account in Switzerland or BVI, or I have an entity, and just because I have it, it's illegal. We have to do better than that. If we're really going to seek out the truth, you got to do a little bit more work than that. So the premise that something is illegal without providing the proof, we have to get past that and go on to the next stage of these articles. I'll start to show you a couple. Where's that? This one. Okay, these are the basics, a basic slide on basically how I divide things up in 3 parts for law firms that create items, and then they use those entities for certain things. Obviously, the worst one is the one that involves tax evasion, okay, or whatever you call it in your country, the actual violation of a financial rule. In those instances where a law firm or the individual owners of these entities use those entities to violate their home country rules, in the U.S. it's easy. You have a tax return that's required to be filed, whether it's corporation, partnership, individual. If you're doing something that violates your home country rules and you're committing tax evasion, or if the mere existence of those entities and the money flowing through them cannot be explained easily. GERARD was in some of his articles that were put out, you saw individuals that had money in these accounts, and they might have been a regular worker, someone who earns, several $1,000s a year, or someone who's a government worker. If you see somebody who's a government worker and they make $60,000 a year and they're moving $200 million to an account, there's a problem. You still got to prove what it is, but there's a problem with that individual. So in some cases, in our country, we call that a net worth case. You have to prove that the individual did not have the capacity to earn that money, but you still got to prove it. But the obvious ones are where the entities are being used for tax evasion schemes, and I'll show you some of those in Panama, or where the possession of wealth by the individual cannot be explained in any manner. So the next one are the non-criminal ones, but obviously are unethical. I think that's where probably the Iceland Prime Minister fell into, where he was making statements about buying Iceland, promoting his country for trade, don't buy overseas, don't do certain things, yet he had these entities that I believe his wife owned that had assets in their name. So in that particular case, that's a problem also, but probably not criminal. And that's usually with politicians or foreign officials where they're required to do some form of public disclosure. A public official, a politician, head of a company where they're required to submit something to say, I own X, Y, and Z. And then later you find out that they actually own something else. So that's just an improper ethical position on financial disclosures. And if that's the case, they need, and they resign over it, so be it. Also, there's a position of hypocrisy where if you're saying one thing and doing another. So if you're in the U.S. and you're saying, buy American, invest American, invest in this and that, and then you're overseas with a private account somewhere doing something else, then obviously what you're doing and what you're saying are two different things. And that's a problem also. That's unethical. The issue with post-tax and pre-tax money in the U.S., if most money used in offshore entity crimes are pre-tax money. In other words, they have not yet been taxed, whether it's from business income or interest income, investment income. It's money that has not yet been taxed. 95% of all crimes are done with pre-tax money. Okay? If it's post-tax money, in other words, you already paid tax on that investment, you already paid tax on your income, you can do whatever you want with it. And we need to be careful not to confuse the two. When you see money in an overseas account, you need to determine if it's pre-tax money or if the gentleman or the entity or the person has already paid tax. If they pay tax, they can do whatever they want with that money. They can put it in 100 accounts, they can move it every day, they can make it look bad, they could move it between countries. Doesn't matter. They already paid tax to their home country on the money. They can move it as they see fit, as long as they're reporting their interest income, dividend income, things like that. On the legal tax avoidance side, the last part there, again, you can be as aggressive as you want with tax avoidance. My position is pretty much all of us are from representative democracies, and your country sets the rules for their own citizens. If they decide to have XYZ laws and you're following those laws, good for you. Whatever else you want to do with your money, you do with it. If those countries wanted to change their laws, they would do so. And if you don't like the law, then don't live in the country. But the reality is, if you're following all the rules associated with your country, you should be okay. And as long as you're not colluding with another person to violate their country rules, similar to what happened with UBS, where you had the bankers coming to the United States helping U.S. citizens purposely evade U.S. tax laws that they knew about. So you can't collude with others to violate someone's laws. Legal tax avoidance, if you're doing it for asset distribution, as we talked about, safety issues, liability. Most countries require a local entity to be in place for you to do business in their country for banking purposes. If that's the reason why you're doing it, great. As long as it's taxed properly and reported to your home country, then you're good. So that's how I divide up most of the 3 sets, including the stuff that just came out with the Panama Papers. The connection between the entities and the bank accounts are very important. Most of the articles that are out there now, we are talking about entities. There's just a name and a person saying Mr. Smith owns an account in Switzerland. There you go. Well, that's not enough. Nowadays, you have to tie the money. Most financial crimes are associated with the money. Where's the money? Somewhere in these articles, somewhere in the connection, somebody has to pull up and say, Mr. Smith owns that entity in Switzerland, and the bank account associated with it, or the money that's funding that trust or that corporation that's in that bank account is here. And then show why that's a crime. So let's not be dishonest in the international community. Just having an entity is not enough. You have to show where the money is and whether or not the possession of that money is a crime in your home country or even in your host country. So the 3 choices usually with money coming in to support a bank account is that the beneficial owner does not want their name on the account. That's the point. So usually the money comes into an account where the owner of the money, their name is not on the account, because if that's the case, then it would be easy to find. So if Mr. Johnson sends money overseas, I found 3 main choices where they could put the money. Number 1, you could put it into the law firm's account, some form of operating account or a joint account, a clearing account, wherever they put their combined client money. That's very common overseas, very common in Panama. That's the hardest one, because once the money gets there, it becomes circulated within a multi-person account. So it's not as easy to track in, it's not easy to track out, and it has the nomenclature of the law firm on it. So when money goes in and out, all you're going to see is the law firm. So that's a little bit harder to track if it goes into this holding account. The money can go into a bank account under a nominee name. It could either be the same name of that company that you're looking at, or it could be another layer, a 3rd company, a 4th company, a 5th company. And that's how they do it. You keep stacking the layers so that the separation of the money from the owner, that there's several layers in between. So you can have the money in a nominee account. Somebody's going to have to be the signature on that account, and it's usually the law firm's employees or some intermediary that's signing and controlling the bank account for the law firm or controlling the bank account for the nominee owner. And then the 3rd one is the least one used is money is in a bank account overseas in the owner's name. So it does happen. You'll have individuals that want to hide money. They'll send it overseas. They'll create the corporation, foundation, trust, whatever layers they want. They'll separate themselves from the control of the companies, but at the local bank, because they're paranoid, they'll want their names on the local bank account. Those are the really paranoid investors that, although they want to hide stuff, they don't want to lose control over it either. So in some cases, you'll see the bank account with the actual owner's name on it, because he just can't give up signature authority, and he has a problem with that. But usually it's under the name of nominees, signers from the entity. So attaching the money to the entity and the owner is the key if you really want to know the right answer. You have to attach the scheme with the entity with the money, because as we know, without the money, there's really no proof of the crime. The second thing is you got to follow the money and tie it into the beneficial owner. If you can't tie money into the beneficial owner, then what are you saying about the beneficial owner? Are you just making a claim that can't be supported? If you're going to be a real litigator or hire people to do real forensic work and go out there, you have to somehow, through an employee, through a law firm employee, through a scorned wife or husband, through a fellow friend, through whoever it is that's giving you your information on the scheme, you have to tie those together. If not, you're speculating, and you're not being fair to the person who owns the account. And you also have to prove if the law firm is involved with the scheme. A lot of times the law firms set up the accounts and then they give it to an intermediary or a third party that maybe does the dirty work for them. But in most cases I saw in Panama, like GERARD has found in some of his papers, usually the law firm's involved. They're the ones because they want to control it and because they want to earn the fees. So all these schemes that are done through these law firms are done for the purpose of making some form of profit. So if you're doing, and we'll go over a couple of schemes here, if you're doing those schemes, the law firm is making a profit on each and every scheme on controlling that. And we'll go over some of those right now. So these are some of the basic schemes. There's probably about 30 good ones. There's a top 10 that's been going around for probably since World War II. You know, thievery and financial crimes is not new. It's been going on for generations, probably several hundred years. Hide the money from the government, so nobody knows where it is. So some of the basics ones they're pretty easy. False expenses. I'm a company in the U.S. I want money to go overseas. I want to set up an account. I want to build up a balance for use later. So I have somebody issue me an invoice. You can create it yourself, but usually the law firm will create it for you. Say you owe malpractice insurance, you owe management fees, you fill in the blank, any item's great, but it would come on a good letterhead. It would be a real company. It'll be an entity that was set up, has a real corporate structure or trust or foundation, whatever it might be. They'll invoice the U.S. company as an example. The U.S. company will pay the bill. You now have a check going overseas. If an auditor comes to your location, you show them, hey, I paid this expense. You expense on your tax return, you expense it, so you're getting a benefit immediately in the first year for the expense. The money ends up overseas. The law firm or whatever entity is controlling your entities puts the money away for you, and now you have money set aside. You get an expense reduction, you get rid of pre-tax money, and you start building up your account overseas. Very simple. The second one, false losses or investments, similar, a little bit more paperwork. You have a company that sells you shares. You're going to invest in we'll take some of Harris's examples. You're going to invest in a teak farm in Costa Rica, and the shares are X amount, or you're going to invest in a new factory, and you invest in it, and that company gives you really good quality paperwork back to show the ownership of your shares, and at a later time, they issue you some document showing that the company went belly up, it lost all of its money, you didn't get the permit you wanted, whatever, you got a loss. So on your personal tax return in the U.S., you would show the loss from your investment, so you get a deduction. And again, your money was sent overseas and is now sitting in an account for your use. Re-invoicing, transfer pricing. This is probably the biggest one that there's a ongoing battle with. There is legitimate transfer pricing. The world community believes that if you're going to do real transfer pricing, the product has to physically move. Okay, so there's a lot of companies that might send the product, let's say through the Panama Cologne free trade zone in order to get a tax break. If the product physically moves there, you could do real transfer pricing. But in reality, what transfer pricing is I'm in the US and I sell my product to a third party. I'm selling generators. Okay, the generators cost me $1,000 and I sell them for $10,000. So I'm going to make a $9,000 profit on the sale of one generator. I should be reporting a $9,000 profit minus expenses. That's what should go on my tax return. But what happens is I create entities through this law firm, like Fonseca, and create a company that wishes to buy my generators. So they buy my generators for $1,400 instead of $10,000. So it's a cost is $1,000. I sell it to the entity that Fonseca made for me for $1,400. I only have a $400 profit. And then the Fonseca firm that was created for my purpose to transfer price, then that company sells it to the end buyer for $10,000. And then the profit is now accumulated overseas. So what happens in the U.S., you get a reduced profit on your business return, and the accumulated profits are stripped overseas, and the product never goes to Panama. It just gets shipped directly from the factory straight over. That's probably the biggest one and the easiest one for law firms to do. And it's the one that generates the most fees for the law firms because it's a constant flow of paperwork. The more paperwork they produce, the more they're going to charge you for. So that's a really good one. That's probably top three. Equity stripping, a little bit difficult. You have a business, you want to sell business. I want to sell my mall that I've owned for years. My basis in the mall is $1 million. I want to sell it for $10 million. I should make a $9 million profit on the mall, but I don't want to pay $9 million in profit or capital gains. So what I do is I have a law firm in Panama create a company for me. That company creates a fake debt instrument. The debt instrument is against my business, so that when I go to closing and I sell my $10 million mall for my $1 million basis mall for $10 million, and I should have $9 million, I introduce a fake debt instrument for $8.5 million. So at closing, the closing company submits a check for $8.5 million to the debt company for closing costs. Of course, all debt has to be settled at closing, and that $8.5 million goes overseas to my account in Panama. Pretty simple. Now that requires pretty good paperwork. The entity, the law firm has to create a good debt instrument, show whatever the closing company needs, but it's a great method of stripping large dollar amounts quickly off the sale of a major asset. That happens all the time, more than you guys think you know. The top right one is something that the U.S. has, and I think other countries have similar ones. We call it 1031 code section, like-kind exchanges. It's when you're going to sell something, but you're going to buy something of a similar quality quickly. So in the U.S., you have technically between 45 days and 180 days. If I say I'm going to sell a mall for $30 million, I don't want to pay profit on the $30 million. I tell the government I'm going to buy another mall for the same price or higher. The government won't charge me a profit on the $30 million because it's basically a swap. So what the government does is they give you 45 to 180 days for a qualified intermediary firm to validate that you did buy something else. And what you do is you don't have to pay the profit on the sale of the property because you replaced it with a like-kind property. So what happens? The law firm overseas, again, becomes the qualified intermediary, submits the paperwork to the government saying we are a qualified intermediary and we have vouched that the property was, a new property was purchased with the same type of environment. Mall for a mall, apartment complex for apartment complex. And right there you can obviously strip out huge amounts of profits from major assets quickly. And that happens all the time overseas. Diverted income is the easiest one. If you're a business owner and you need to divert pre-tax income, all you do is introduce you just tell your vendor. The vendor wants to buy those generators from you, and instead of making it out to your company, ABC Corp., you tell them, hey, I have a subsidiary that's shipping you the product, so just make it out to, the Fonseca created company. And they make out the check for the product to that company. They give you the check, you send it overseas, they deposited it into the same bank account with the same name. Pretty simple. That goes on all the time, the diverted income. It's the easiest one to find because if you're looking for it, you go to the vendors of that person and you say who you're paying. If they give you invoices for a company other than the name of your target, you got diverted income. So that's an easy one to catch, but you have to get out there and do it. Again, all this money is set aside for the beneficial owner overseas. And the last one, bribes, profits. This is more politician stuff. The easiest one is, a politician wants to get paid for doing something improper, like zoning a building or giving you access or making a highway ramp for you, something that really gives you a lot of value. Instead of obviously paying the person who helped you, the politician has the cousin, the third party person, a related construction company, just pay you separately, directly overseas to Panama or any other country you're using. So that's a pretty simple one. You just have to have a person helping you. So politician wants to pay you back for something or give you a bribe, you just make sure that it's a second, third, fourth party. They write the check, it goes overseas, gets deposited into account that you're the beneficial owner of. So these are all the top, what are these here? Top 7, top 8 schemes. If you go out there and look at these law firms, they're probably doing 90% of their businesses are these. Pretty straightforward. The next slide. A lot of people ask, well, what do they do with the money when it's there? Most people just want to accumulate the money. They want a rainy day fund. They want to start stripping stuff off. They want to, I want to get rich. I want to put something somewhere. I got a scheme running and I don't want people to see it. So they just usually let it build up. And the majority of people will allow the fund to build up for a substantial amount of time, sometimes years. If they put the money overseas, it's usually pre-tax money. They're not paying interest on it. They invest the money. They don't report anything. It's just hiding over there in somebody else's bank, somebody else's name, but the law firm, of course, knows you're the beneficial owner. And I'm sure if we looked in the records of this company, you'll find some list that ties the client to the name of the companies, which is key. There'll be some list somewhere, some spreadsheet which says, Mr. Smith from London owns these 5 companies. And then from those companies, there's probably a list that says these companies have these bank accounts. And if that's exposed, you would quickly be able to determine, Prime Minister here owns this company, that company owns these 3 banks, and then go look at those banks and you'll see all the transactions. You always got to find a bank account. So the second one, you can invest funds overseas, you accumulate. There's plenty of investment houses that will take the funds from an entity that is legal overseas, wherever the funds are parked. There's plenty of investment houses. If the paperwork's right, we'll take those funds and invest it for that corporation. Not a problem. Not a problem overseas. Bank credit cards is what really got us into the years ago, how we backed into the Switzerland accounts, the John Doe, some of this years ago, about 15 years ago, we started seeing the use of the credit cards because people wanted to spend the money, right? You don't want to have money if you can't spend it. So one quick way is they would start using credit cards that were purchased in another country. They would fund the credit card through the law firm. They would give you the credit card, and then you would just go about your business in the U.S. or overseas, and you would spend the money using those credit cards. Now, some people say, well, aren't you going to get found out? No, because the credit card statement goes back to the law firm. You got no mail coming to your house every time you go to dinner or buy a vacation, unless you were looking at that vendor. So let's say you bought 6 first-class tickets. Unless you're an investigator and you go to the airlines and you say, well, how did he pay for that? They'll show you, oh, that's the credit card. And you'll have to take the credit card, go back into the banks and say, oh, that credit card is to a bank in wherever they got the credit card from. It'll be tied into a bank at another country. That's one way of doing it. That's the old way. You have to go to each vendor and then say, oh, there's the card. And then you got to go to the card and then ask the bank overseas with the card, who owns the card? They'll tell you that's XYZ Corp in Panama. Now you got to go back to the corporation in Panama. So you got to keep following it backwards. But credit cards is the easy one because there's no trace. It doesn't come back to the person in the States or in your home country. And you can use as much as you want, and it's just taken out of your account because you own the money. And the law firm keeps track of that and charges you for that, whoever's taking care of the assets. And then, of course, you could purchase stuff using your overseas companies. If you run into somebody and you're looking at them because you think they're a cheat, and you see that they're buying boats and planes and cars, and then you go and look up the title of the boats and planes and cars, and you see it's Company A, then you got to go to Company A and figure out who owns Company A and go back and back and back. But that's one way of getting your money out, purchasing large assets. Wire transfers are easy. You got to pay a bill, you got to pay a vendor, just tell the law firm where you want the money to go, and they'll wire the money out of your account. Liquid assets are becoming very strong today because of the heavy exposure of these schemes. So a lot of people are saying, wow, I don't even want to be in a bank account now. I want to, okay, so accumulate your money. They'll go buy gold. They'll buy artwork, stick it in their house, something that the government's not normally tracking, that they're not keeping track of. Buy diamonds, stick them into a safe deposit box. It sounds like movie stuff, but it is. They'll just buy commodities, store it somewhere. I've seen cases where individuals have bought boxes of Krugerrands, the old South African gold coins. I think they're still in play. And they would just have the boxes. There'd be one at their house, one at their apartment, maybe one buried in the backyard, one in a safe deposit box, so that if they ever needed money, they would just show up and grab the diamonds or the gold. That's old school, but it works. The basic schemes from the old days of having something you can grab still works today, of course. So those are the ways of using the money. So hard work has to be done to find the truth. We all should be living by a maxim of not reporting, not living by lies, of living by facts and the truth. A general theme in our culture, and we know it from our kids, is to just Google it. Oh, it's on Wikipedia, it must be true. Yeah. I saw somebody report it, or I saw somebody do a 20-minute story on the news, so it must be true. But that's not enough. That's our culture nowadays, is just listen to a story, watch a TV show, see one paper, see one news report, and say that's what it is. But we got to do a little bit more work than that. If you break your home country rules, as a former agent and as somebody who likes to see all the economies to be strong, I think if you break your home country rules, you're going to get in trouble. And if you help somebody else break your home country rules, or you help somebody else break their rules, you should be in trouble also. I'm all for transparency. I think there should be some transparency in all financial transactions. There should be some privacy. You know, I don't think there should be secrecy, but there should be some privacy. If you're not bothering the government and you're paying your taxes, you should be allowed to accumulate wealth and buy a painting without having to report it to the government. But you do have to follow the rules. There is a price for us in a civilized society, and it's an old quote. It's actually on our IRS building in downtown Washington, if you've seen it. It's from one of our Supreme Court justices, and it says that taxes are a price of civilized society. We know that. So there has to be some taxes paid in order to support the funding of what's going on in our society. I agree that corporations should be paying their proper share of taxes, whatever the law says they should be paying. They should be paying, and we should be aggressive about it. But we should also be aggressive about everybody paying their fair share. There's not a lot of continuity in most tax laws in each country. There's always somebody paying too much, whether it's the rich people, the middle class. In our particular country, as you know, the lower 50% do not pay federal income tax. The last figure was 48% of U.S. persons in the lower bracket do not pay federal income tax. They pay sales tax, they pay Medicare tax, Social Security. But can you imagine that? Half of our country is not paying into the federal system. In fact, a portion of that half is also receiving credits, refunds on their tax returns. So in reality, more than 48% is not even kicking in a dollar to the federal government. So there is some inconsistencies in our tax system as in other countries. Everybody should pay a fair share, including corporations. We all need, we have to have funding to run our country. So I agree with my fellow speaker here on the disclosure of the papers. I would prefer, as a former investigator, that his company release all the documents. I think it's fair if you have something, to release all of it, not just a portion of it, or authorize some journalists who they hand select or who want to spend the time and money, or companies that wish to spend the time and money, to access it so that they can match the corporate data to the bank accounts, to the emails, to everything else that they have in those records. I don't think it's enough just to release a piece of the product, because as we know, there's correspondence in their emails, banking account information. And that's where I tell you is the key, the bank accounts tied into the corporation. So if I was them, if there was some legal way they could do it without getting in trouble, I would release all the records. Tax avoidance is legal, tax evasion is not. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
So questions now, right, guys? Yeah. I've just got a quick question. So I tried to get Ramon Fonseca to participate in the panel, and he didn't ask me to, he sent me an email declining. He didn't ask me to read it out, but I just think that it's probably fair. So he said, the only crimes committed here are the hacking and a violation against Article 12 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as a violation of the confidential privilege between client and attorney. If you are following the news, there is nothing legal against us, only media noise, and we refuse to sit on the same table with one of the criminals responsible for these violations. Thanks to people like him, privacy a basic human right, is already on the list of species in danger of extinction. So what are your comments to that, Gerard?
Are you sure that wasn't aimed at art? No? Look, I think there's been overwhelming public interest in these documents, and I think that overwhelming public interest outrides anything that Fonseca is actually saying. And you've got to remember, this is a person who basically has made a lot of money from not knowing who his end user is. We found when we were researching the documents, I remember distinctly typing in just randomly one day the word Pyongyang, and then finding that basically here was a company that had been, its registered address, or the address of the people that were registering it, were actually in North Korea. And it turned out when we cross-referenced that with the sanctions list, that this was a company that was the front company for the North Korean regime. So, I mean, and there was example after example of that in the documents. We were very careful, and we made a very conscious decision at the beginning. You know, we probably underplayed the role of the banks and the big four accountancy firms and other things, because we felt we'd talked about that before. We'd actually done stories in the past on that. We focused entirely almost on the public officials. And when you have a public official who has an offshore account and you don't know about it, and they're supposed to have told you, then I think that is a, you know, that's of public interest. I mean, Fonseca basically has made a lot of money over the years by deliberately turning a blind eye to things. There was clear examples in here of deliberate tax evasion. You know, for instance, the European Savings Directive came in 2005, I think, and the banks were basically scrambling to, what happened there was that if you had your name on an account, then you were liable to pay tax. But if you moved the account to a company, then you didn't have to pay tax. And so there was a huge market for it. And the banks basically went to, you know, Mossack Fonseca, and basically registered companies that would then be linked to the bank accounts, and they were no longer linked to the individuals, so they avoided tax. They knew what they were doing, and in fact they were admitting it in the emails. I mean, the beauty about this is that you could go back through every single email and every single correspondence. There was no doubt they knew that there was wrongdoing going on here. So, you know, again, I would argue that, you know, public interest has been served here.
My name is Peter Kotachanu. I'm a lawyer with Annefit Attorneys at Law in Zurich. If we take your argument to its logical extreme that public interest trumps the right of privacy, there's a lot of public interest in all of these documents. And in fact, I had heard last week at a conference that the ICIJ lawyered up extensively before this release. Would you be willing to disclose whether you took advice on whether receiving stolen property was a crime? I assume you're not, as protected by the attorney-client privilege, and yet there's public interest in that, at least on my part, and I think on several other people's parts. And I think a more important question is, if your documents were hacked, if your communications with your lawyer were hacked, and people wanted to know about that advice, would you object to it being disclosed to the press? I suspect you would.
Well, you've answered your own question there, I think. So do you want me to answer it as well? Or, I mean, yeah. I find it hard. I mean, you're talking about privacy. There was a lot of private stuff in there that we did not publish. There were a lot of individuals in there that we did not name. And there was, I mean, basically there was, you know, access to people's passports and other details. The reason why we're not publishing everything is for that reason. It's actually for privacy reasons. But we do think, and again, we do think it's important to have the basic information made public. And the reason we're saying that is because world leaders like David Cameron, who gave a press conference at the White House in 2013 and said the basic information in offshore companies, like who is the ultimate beneficial owner of a company, should be made public. It's the kind of information you can normally get in each country, but when you go offshore, there are different rules. So we're just applying the rules that are being imposed by world leaders and basically putting that standard to play here.
Was the data obtained from a leak or a hack?
I mean, the information went to the German reporter, Bastian Obermeier. He dealt entirely with the source, and I can tell you, having dealt with sources like this in the past, that was a burden for him. He had to deal with the source the entire way through. The first meeting we had after I came back from Munich was with our lawyer, and basically asked him, can we use this material? And, there's one huge advantage of working in the US is that you can do things here that you may not be able to do elsewhere. And there was no question of illegality here at all. And we were allowed to use this material as long as we could, basically prove the public interest. And there was overwhelming public interest. You're talking about 140 elected officials that we know about, and hundreds more of their family and associates that we don't know about, that we might find out next week when we make some of the more of the details public.
But do you know if the person who provided the information to the German journalists obtained it through hacking, or was it somebody from the inside leaking it? So was it somebody from the outside hacking into the Mossack system, or was it somebody from within Mossack producing it to the outside world?
The honest answer is I don't know. The only person who can answer that is maybe Bastian Obermeier, the journalist who was dealing with the source. I can put my hand on my heart, I don't know.
Excuse me, where are all the Americans? Where are the Americans? I mean, we've had exposure about all sorts of people from all over the globe. But where are all the high-profile Americans?
Well, one thing you've got to be careful of as a journalist is that you can't make up stories. You can't go in and wish that you had Hillary Clinton or you wish you had Donald Trump in the material. Believe me, we looked. I mean, it's one of the first things you do as a journalist is you type in your wish list of people that you know would make the best stories. But after a while, you learn that you've got to go where the documents lead you because you're a journalist and you've got to be able to prove what you're going to write. There were quite a number of Americans in the data, and you're able to do searches. We basically learned from one of our Swiss colleagues when we met in Munich, when we had several in-person meetings along the way, and he worked out a way of basically allowing us to search every passport in there for every country, because there's actually a code in every passport that I didn't realize until that moment. There were quite a number of Americans. They're mostly fraudsters, to be frank, and we're about to publish a story to go with the database launch to show how many fraudsters were in there. And these are people that basically have caused a lot of harm here. There's one in particular, there was a tragic drowning in New York State, where basically an insurance company was set up and it was a fake insurance company. When people drowned, no one could get compensation. But there were lots of other more common frauds in there. We did not find that many politicians. A number of these stories have been written, by the way. People have not been following. Our local partner in the US was the McClatchy Group, which is the Miami Herald, is their flagship company. We also worked with Fusion. And then we worked, because the documents were in both Spanish and English, we worked with Univision, and they did a number of stories. People keep saying, where are the Americans? Well, there were no prime ministers, I'm sorry. But there were lots of Americans in there.
Yeah, I think that fake insurance company was in St. Kitts and Nevis. I think it could have been Nevis, and a guy called Irvin Bonkamper, if my memory serves me correctly, who was a real slug of the highest order. We'd written about him several times. He was subsequently convicted. I believe he's in prison, or if he's not, he didn't get out that long ago. And so that was a fake insurance company, or it's a real insurance company providing fake insurance, and most of the people who died on that boat trip, I think, were elderly. I think it was a trip for elderly people.
Yeah, it was a real tragedy. I mean, they're the kind of things you were looking at in the data. We generated about 5,000 story tips by the end of this, because every time someone would go into the iHub, which is our virtual newsroom, they found something. We actually discarded most of them in the end because we just didn't have the capacity to print everything. I mean, at ICIJ, we only do the global story. We allow the local partners to do the stories that are relevant to their communities. So the Brazilians, obviously, were interested in Brazil mostly. But often, our Dutch reporters found a lot of links to Brazil that were actually relevant to Holland, and vice versa. This story was very global. I mean, the thing about the offshore world is that it is entirely global, so it's perfect for an organization like ICIJ. I mean, it's not all we do, by the way. We do other stories, but it's impossible for us not to come back to the offshore world, because almost everything bad that happens in the world eventually goes back to some sort of offshore company. And I say that, when I say offshore, I'm not talking about a Caribbean island. I'm actually talking about here in the US as well, because Mossack Fonseca had offices in Nevada and here in Florida, and they were doing a lot of business here. Not necessarily with Americans, but a lot of money that's going through the Miami real estate was going through, and it's a lot of Latin American money flowing through the system here. And I think there's a real incentive for the first world countries like America not to stop this happening, because it's basically propping up property prices and keeping us all rich.
I'd like to add to that, just to answer Philip's question. I think that the Miami Herald focused on the larger stories, and they went after those because they're looking at money flows through Miami, and the stories have been great. But my guess is there's a whole bunch of orthopedic surgeons and ophthalmologists and lawyers who have offshore accounts that are hiding assets. It's just not a sexy story yet, but that's going to come out, my guess is, eventually. So this idea that, and we've seen this in some of the press, that, you know, somehow because no American names are coming out, or not many, that this undermines the credibility of this. My guess is there's a lot of Americans there, and the IRS will be knocking on their door at some point, and good for them. The second point, just to take up my new good friend Peter's comments, and I truly mean that. I think his comments about the attorney-client privilege are very important. None of us would like the attorney-client privilege invaded, right? Lightly. However, hang on. No, I don't think that's fair, Peter, because the attorney-client privilege is not absolute. And it's not meant to be a bulwark to hide behind when you're doing illegal things. And what we've seen so far from the information that's come out, and I've chased Mossack Fonseca, I've had them tell me things. We'll find out soon whether those things are true or not. But in the two instances that have been reported, it's clear from the emails that they were engaging in dialogue and emails with their clients to evade people looking at companies that were under inquiry, whether it be by subpoena because their judgments were unpaid, or because they were trying to avoid taxes, or for other reasons. And when a law firm steps over that line and becomes someone who is participating in the crime and in the fraud, they deserve to lose their good name. They deserve to lose their business. They deserve to lose their clients. They deserve everything that happens to them. So to my way of thinking, the attorney-client privilege, we have to find a way to lower that. We still need the protection of it. It's a super important privilege, but it should not be a barrier that cannot be leapt over. And I will say, and I've said it in our panel earlier, judges are terrified of going near it. Trying to get the attorney-client privilege set aside on a crime-fraud exception, I see nodding, is very, very hard for anyone in the room that's ever tried it. So while I agree with you in general that an attorney-client privilege is very, very important, we have to find a way to allow this type of information to come out, because to me, those emails are the key. Those emails are going to show the conscious effort made by Mossack Fonseca lawyers and operatives to assist people to hide what they were doing. That's not right. There's no way you can ever justify that.
I just want to make a point, which is the point that Gerald made, which was that sort of the greater public interest justifies this release. There's a great public interest in all of these documents. If the ICIJ were hacked and somebody wanted to release all these documents, I'm sure the ICIJ would object to that, and I would fully support their objection. The attorney-client privilege is one thing, theft is another thing. And while I fully support the ICIJ, and I fully support what Ed does in shining the spotlight on corruption in the offshore world, don't take anything I've ever said at this conference to defend that. I'm fully on your side. But I think we've got to be very, very careful about how we go exposing that corruption, because there's a lot of good people and good transaction that can be hurt by what's going on now with this culture of data theft.
Yeah. David, the two comments on the former government side is that the government will accept stolen data under certain circumstances. One, if somebody walked in the door and gave all that data that GERARD got to us, we would accept it, but it would be for criminal matters only. Obviously, there won't be any release of public information just to embarrass anybody or just to disclose it. It would be used for criminal matters. We would ask the source how they got it. If they told us they stole it or they're an employee, we would say, don't do it again. That's the general process, is you cannot direct somebody to steal something, to break in, to take something from somebody else, somewhere where they're not employed anymore. But we would take the original one because we did not direct them to do so. But then they would be used in a criminal matter one by one, and then they would be disclosed in the court system publicly if they're not sealed as they're convicted or indicted or arrested. So I would probably think that in the very near future, some of my cohorts or some of the other agencies that deal in the same matter are going to be issuing a MLAT request to Panama for a copy of the records that the Panamanians had probably copied when they did the search warrant at the location a few weeks after the first reports came out. So there is a copy for law enforcement. It's in Panama, and it's in the possession of the government. So I'm sure soon the government will be requesting that. Whatever they get, they'll process it the way they always do, one case at a time, and then disclose it as they become indicted.
Has the ICIJ been threatened with, with litigation over this?
Yes is a short answer, but
Is that confidential information?
yeah.
I'll
not
just hack
necessarily
it from your side.
Well, shall we say, I expected a lot more. I mean, we've had very little pushback.
And have any lawsuits been issued?
No. Well, yes, I would be aware of it, believe me.
David earlier asked you a direct question. The information originally retained, was it by way of hack or was it by way of leak? And your answer was, I don't know. Is there not an obligation on you? Banks have know your client obligations. Lawyers are required, in fact, to make inquiries of their clients before they take them on. Do you also not have an obligation to know where the information comes and to say, I don't know, isn't good enough?
It's actually a really good question, and I'm happy to answer it. It's a different process for journalists. We're not lawyers. The obligation on us is to make sure that the information is accurate. And we have to go outside the data to make sure that's actually the case. We had been looking at Mossack Fonseca. We've been looking at them before we got the data, so we knew that they were a firm of interest, public interest. We did an awful lot of work going outside the data to make sure this information was correct. And we also spent a lot of time then asking questions of the people we're going to name. I mean, for instance, the Prime Minister of Iceland, we went to him 3 weeks beforehand. He had 3 weeks basically knowing this was coming. And it's one of my, again, one of the nice things that, I say nice things, but it was one of the things that stick in my memory because, of course, the company was called Wintris. And the Icelandic reporter we'd recruited to work with us had been working alone on this for 9 months. He couldn't tell anyone. He gave up his job in Iceland to be able to work on this story. He basically was supported by his wife. And in order to keep his spirits up, I'd gone over there, but he went in every day to the virtual newsroom to keep going, and it became a kind of a saying near the end, Wintris is coming. And then the day that we published, he emailed me and said, Wintris has arrived. So, yeah.
I'm David Adams with Univision, so I've been working with other members of our newsroom on some of these stories. And just to answer the question about Americans, our partners, Fusion, published a very good story the other day about Triple Canopy, which fell into the bracket of ethical behavior. I don't think it was, I don't think we suggested it was anything criminal, but Triple Canopy, obviously an important American firm. And we have been scouring the documents for Americans and also people living in America who aren't necessarily Americans, or sometimes we're not sure because they ask Mossack Fonseca to identify themselves under foreign passports, although they may have US citizenship too. And we have withheld publication on many stories that we think are close to being evidence of unethical or criminal behavior, but we just can't be sure. And we're not going to speculate until we are absolutely sure. So I wanted to make that very clear to back up what Gerald said. My question to you both is, where does this go now that a large part of the documents are going to be released to the public? And you mentioned that you were going to be very interested to see what other relatives or associated people come out. Is that you then hoping that there's actually sort of people come out of the woodwork, or the public actually approaches you having had a look at the documents themselves, and new information is forthcoming that way?
Yeah, we're just going on past experience. So when we published the Offshore Leaks database in 2013, we got about 500 tips from the public, which led us to a number of other stories. We're also bringing more journalists into this collaboration. I mean, I failed to mention that we worked with 107 media organizations around the world in more than 76 countries. So that's where the 370 journalists come from. We didn't work in certain countries like New Zealand, and Turkey, other places that we didn't have journalists in place, and also got to the point where we just could not cope with any more journalists, because every time we brought a new media organization in, there was a lot of management on our part, and we're journalists. We're trying to do journalism, and we're trying to manage, and we're trying to basically coordinate this whole thing, and we're also trying to keep everything secret. And there were lots of occasions where people, had good excuses to publish certain bits and pieces. I mean, there was a big crisis in Brazil shortly before we published, which has now led to the downfall of the government. We had material on that would have been relevant, but we had to obviously calm the Brazilians down. There was another crisis in Malta, I remember. There was Infantino being elected as the head of FIFA was a bit of a surprise to us, because he was in the data, not necessarily in a bad way, but he was there. And so we had to calm everyone down as we were going along. So what we're going to do is and we're already doing this, we're bringing new media partners in countries where we didn't work, and we're allowing them to basically look at the material. And already there is actually a crisis in New Zealand over this, even though we haven't got a New Zealand partner. But John Key, the New Zealand Prime Minister, is under a lot of pressure because of the various answers that he gave to certain questions that were asked when the Panama Papers first came out. So we're now working with public radio and public TV in New Zealand to see if we can find out more about that.
What's almost assuredly going on right now is that all these clients that have accounts at Fonseca are undoubtedly in the last few weeks meeting with their counsel. It's obvious. It happens every time. It happened when we did the voluntary disclosure program. It happens every time there's a leak. You're going to have all these clients that have not yet been named, who are doing the financial crimes but are not politicians and didn't get included on round one. They're meeting with defense counsel, and they're discussing how am I going to disclose this and what's the least punishing way to do it. The obvious answer for most defense attorneys is if you disclose it first, you might forestall a criminal investigation. Disclose it, amended returns, payment up front. That's one huge track that most of these taxpayers are going to take. They're just going to disclose it and hope for the best and pray that the government doesn't still feel like charging them. But generally, that will stall most of the criminal investigations if there's a disclosure and payment up front. So that's the discussion going on with their counsel right now. I'm sure there's a lot of happy lawyers earning fees.
Gerard, did Mossack Fonseca threaten to sue the ICIJ?
No, not at all. They were they actually went public and attacked us in the media. They didn't initially answer any of the questions that we put to them. And then, of course, we had more and more media going to them with the same questions, and eventually they did issue a press statement. At one point, they were surrounded by media in Panama a few weeks before we were published. But no, they've never threatened. I believe they've made a criminal complaint in Panama surrounding the leak of the material. It's not against us. Certainly, I'll probably avoid Panama for the rest of my life. But apart from that, no. There's the point is, what can they do? I mean, we're not breaking the law. ICIJ is not breaking the law by doing this. We have very good counsel. Again, I repeat, the very first person that I went to with this after I'd learned about it, after I'd obviously been to the BBC and the Guardian, was our legal counsel. And I said, we sat around for an hour, we discussed every possibility, and it was very simple. We didn't steal the material, therefore it's usable.
I'm also not going to visit Panama. I had a criminal libel action brought against me in 1998.
One possibly unintended effect of this drip feeding of information is to distort the perception in the public of what happens offshore. And a story that I'm interested in is what proportion of the information that's been captured represents legitimate activity versus illegitimate activity. And are we going to hear about that story?
Well, I think a lot of it was legitimate. I mean, obviously, there's nothing, there's nothing wrong in itself of having an offshore company as long as you're not using it for some sort of illicit purpose, such as avoiding tax, or in this case, a lot of it was actually, Mexican drug cartels, laundering money and things like that. But it's impossible, I think, for me to give you a fair answer in terms of what percentage was legal and what percentage was illegal, because there were 11.5 million documents where journalists, the material was arriving, arriving as we were working. It was impossible for us to read every single document. I mean, you talk to my colleagues here in Univision, you have to make judgment calls on what you can do in the time frame you have. When we first went to Munich, when I first flew to Munich and talked to the bosses at Süddeutsche Zeitung, they actually wanted us to do that story in about 3 months, and we had to convince them not to. And in fact, we had lots of, and eventually they agreed that we could do it in 2015, but then as we pushed along, as we had in-person meetings, it became clear that we needed more and more time. Now, we could have taken another year to look at this and probably still not finished and given you a definitive answer for your question. But eventually, at some point or other, you've just got to say, this is the amount of time we have, this is what we're going to publish, and we had to then wrangle everyone to agree to publish it together.
The one or more threats of litigation that you've faced so far arising from this, can you tell us, not identify who they're from, but are they from individuals, or are they on behalf of individuals who've been named?
Well, I think there's a lot of interest from various authorities around the world to get access to this material. And our stated policy is that we're not an arm of government and we don't hand this material over. So, yeah.
So no threats then, no threats of lawsuits against you other than from agencies looking for the information?
It's only, you only end up getting the lawsuit if you make a mistake. And it's, it's almost impossible as a human being not to make mistakes, but we try, obviously, as best we can not to. And I think the law here is very much in our favor because we apply the American system of fact-checking before we publish. And so we actually had all our stories written well in advance of publication, so we could not just provide them to partners because they wanted to translate them, but also so we could make sure that we had our lawyers look at everything and we had everything fact-checked. We had professional fact-checkers, 2 of them sitting in the office for months, basically working on this. And again, it goes to the principle that you can't afford to make a mistake when you're playing this kind of game. I mean, it's high stakes.
But I think you mentioned earlier that you'd been threatened with litigation?
You're always being threatened, but whether or not anyone goes ahead is another thing.
But was that on behalf of individuals who had been identified?
It's hard to answer that question without giving too much away. I'm sorry. So one answer is sorry.
I have a question. Are you aware of any benefits accruing to the source of this material? And if so, are you allowed to say?
I'm aware of no benefit the source has got. The only thing I learned from Bastian about the source was that this person wanted what he or she said were crimes to be made public. I believe that their motivation is pure, but again, I've got no proof of that. It was just, again, from conversations that the source had with Bastian that he made me aware of, and he, it was contained with him, and it was very important that he handle the source because clearly the source wanted a certain outcome. And the outcome was, I mean, I think everyone would have gone onto the Süddeutsche website and seen the correspondence that had taken place between the reporter and the source. Basically, are you interested in data? Yes, and Bastian asked the motivation, and the motivation was, I want these crimes to be made public. So clearly the person thought that what was happening here had some sort of wrongdoing. That's the only motivation I'm aware of.
I was interested to know where you draw the line of the information, the detailed information you release. And you say you're not releasing copies of people's passports, for example. Could you describe the list of things you would release and things you would not release?
Basic information, again, going on what David Cameron said should be made public, which is the ultimate beneficial owner of offshore companies. So a person's name, the offshore company they're linked to, and address they're linked to.
Would you have their banking information, for example?
No.
Their nationality, for example?
Yes.
And
You can search by country.
in light of the new laws coming out for FATCA, which is asking for asset information as a global request to foreign financial institutions, you would think that the global government wants that, because that's what they're asking now for the new law related to the banking system, is asset information. So as I had told Gerard earlier, it would be great if, along with the entity information and the name, there would be a bank account name and location. You don't even have to put the amounts. That would be a 70% solution for finding out criminal activity. But if they're not going to release it, then the government is going to have to go to Panama to get it.
Yeah, it should be. I mean, the Panamanian authorities raided. I mean, Ramon Fonseca, one of the owners of this company, was actually an advisor to the Panamanian government. He resigned in the weeks leading up to the release of this. I don't think it was necessarily our questions. There was a big crisis going on in Brazil at the time, and in fact, Mossack Fonseca had been named publicly in Brazil as a money laundering machine, or words to that effect. It was one of the stories that we were able to see through new lenses because we were looking at our material as this was all happening. But the Panamanian authorities raided Mossack Fonseca. They've also raided private homes. They've seized, as I understand it, a lot of material. And in fact, one report I had was that they have more material than we have. I'm not sure how they could have got that, but and so therefore it's available now if governments want to ask the Panamanian authorities for it.
Does the ICIJ pay for any information?
No, we don't. And we couldn't use it if we paid.
And the funding, the ultimate funding of the ICIJ, is that public information?
Yes, it is. We get money from foundations. I can name them if you wish. There's about 4 or 5.
But the people behind the foundations, are their names, public?
Yes. Yeah. We get money from Odessium, which is a Dutch foundation. We get money from OSF, Open Society Foundations, out of London and in New York. We get money from Sigurd Housing Trust in London.
But the people who fund those organizations are the individuals?
Well, Sigurd Housing is Sigurd Housing. She's a millionaire. We get money from Graham Wood, who's a millionaire in Australia. But yeah, we're a tiny organization. My budget last year was about 1.8 million. I have, as I say, 12 staff and little else, really, paper bands and paper clips.
And are there any indications that you're going to get greater funding because of the publicity surrounding this?
We have been approached by a couple of new foundations, thankfully, but you'll also have read in the Huffington Post 2 days ago that our parent organization has started to lay people off. And in fact, I was asked to not fill 3 positions. So it hasn't all been good for us, I'm afraid. Yep. We have realities, basically. We can only do what our funding allows us to do. And I pretty much brought this project home with the smell of fumes in the end. But I thought it was worth it.
Have been any additional whistleblowers approach you prompted by this publicity?
Yes.
Is that a future chapter or something to talk about?
Well, I think, I'm sorry, I wasn't meaning to be rude. I was literally answering the question. I've always had the feeling that if you start working in this area, that whistleblowers will come to you. When I was talking earlier about the offshore leaks material, that was actually material that had come to me as a result of work I was doing in Australia, or had done in Australia, before I joined the ICIJ. I'd actually been investigating a major fraud in Australia, and as a result of that, I wrote a book. As a result of the book, someone approached me with a whole bunch of material that eventually led to the original offshore leaks story. It was one of the reasons I came to Washington. They did not know at the ICIJ that I had the material, I have to point out, and I didn't do it until nearly a year into my term there as director. But I've always had the feeling that leaks beget leaks. You do this work and someone else will come forward, and then someone else will come forward. I'm hoping, and if anyone's in the audience, you know where to find me now. So please, at some point or other, come to us. Obviously take precautions, make sure you don't get caught. I mean, what I always find with whistleblowers is that you basically get caught before you come to the journalist because you make mistakes, basically. Once you come to the journalist, I can advise you on ways of not getting caught, but it's be very careful before you come to a journalist and make sure you take steps. This person, whoever it was very, very careful. There were very specific instructions from day one. And, you know, I'm very proud of the fact that the offshore leaks whistleblowers, sources have never been caught. And I'm hoping that this, you know, personally, I hope this is the same for this person, even though this person is not my source.
Just one question there.
Just a question on some of the things I've been hearing. You talked about, well, the question is this: do you feel you've made a moral judgment where you have decided to release things in the public interest, which you seem to have because you're not going to give the information to governments? And yet there are other issues around. If you look at, you know, hacking an iPhone here, we can't seem to get that information in the US. So where do you personally feel that you've taken the bar to? And it relates to my question, some of the questions my colleagues raised here. I don't think, I'm not comfortable with you explaining the moral judgments and some of the repercussions of that you see long term. And I think it's normal, we all make moral judgments here for and against. And what are your personal views on that?
Well, I'm a journalist, and I basically like to think that we apply journalistic ethics and code to stories. It's probably hard to quantify if you're not a journalist, but I mean, I think clearly there was overwhelming public interest in this. I mean, you just look at all the resignations we've had and all of the publicity we've had. I mean, I've lost count of the number of stories that have been written about the Panama Papers. I mean, look at the jokes that have been made, even if you go, you know, to This Week Tonight, you know, 7 minutes on this show. At the correspondence dinner, the White House correspondence dinner, there was a joke made about it. You know, it's really, I think, people care about this topic because it goes to the heart of things we care about, which is basically if someone isn't paying enough tax, then you're paying more. And if you don't have enough tax, you can't pay for schools, you can't pay for roads. It's a fundamental issue. It's a fundamental public interest to me. And that's the kind of, that is the only criteria I use when this kind of material comes across my desk. You know, is there public interest in it? It's a different rule, I guess, for lawyers. You look through life in a different way.
Thank you for that, but I note obviously you speak about hospitals, roads and schools and we're not paying enough tax. That seems to be a very moral judgment you're making. I just leave it at that. Thank you.
Sure.
First, let me start by thanking you for the very useful information, very informative presentation. Now, I'd like to know whether your organization is currently doing investigative work in relation to other offshore firms or other firms engaged in offshore finance.
We're interested in all companies. I can tell you I know most of them, and I knew Mossack Fonseca before we got a hold of the material. Again, I would apply a public interest argument to it. If someone came forward with more information, you know, my first job as ICA director, can I sell it? You know, and when I say sell, I don't mean physically sell. Can I sell it as a story idea to the major media partners we work with? Can I go to the BBC news director and say, have I got a story for you? I have to be able to do that in one line every time. And it's harder and harder to do it if you're doing the same type of story. But, and when Bastian Obermeier originally contacted me with this, I just groaned because I thought it's another offshore story. Are people going to be interested in it? But very clearly, from looking at the material, we could see that this was different to anything that we'd done before. And so therefore, I would apply the same criteria. If someone came forward with new material from another company now, I would be looking at it, you know, what's different about this to what we've done before? And even in this story, when I said we underplayed maybe the backs, it's because we'd done the HSBC story 12 months earlier and we knew, and there were some even more incriminating documents in there about HSBC that we looked at and thought, you know what, we've done that story, we need to move on to the other thing. And again, I was very conscious of the fact that it was an anonymous source. I didn't know who the source was. So therefore, for me, it was about the public figures.
Jared. Hello, Jared. It's Martin Kenny speaking. I have a question that relates to a part of the vexing ethical questions that you're facing in making determinations of what information to make public and what not to make public. And some of the sentiments of the questions framed up to you today seem to be concerned about privacy rights, which of course are closely aligned to human dignity, and the notion that it sounds like you're sensitive to not disclosing private information for some kind of prurient reason, but when you say it's in the public interest, that seems to be your standard of review, right? I have another sort of, to add to your vexing issues in terms of ethics. I and some others in this room represent many thousands of victims of global economic crime and corruption. And I can tell you that the model that you're going to be using to try and strike the right balance, it sounds like, between privacy and public access to information that you deem appropriate for such publication is problematic from our perspective in the following sense. You said you're going to publish the UBO data, or the identities of this ostensible ultimate beneficial owners of 200,000 plus Mossack Fonseca companies formed since 1997. I say, as a fraud recovery lawyer for victims, that's excellent. However, I also know, because of personal knowledge with the firm of Mossack Fonseca, and the frustration I have felt over the years in dealing with them in disclosure orders. Just yesterday, I was interviewed by a journalist for 2 hours who is a part of the consortium and who presented me with documents objectively showing that the firm in the BVI thwarted a high court disclosure order in a $40 million approximate obligation enforcement exercise. And the problem that we face is that many of the ostensible UBOs in this database are dummies, are nominees, are men and women of straw. And it takes people who are trained like I am and my team, or Ed Davis's team and others, to tear all that apart. So if we don't have access, as Ed says, to the emails and the payment records and the invoices and all of the material, then we're going to lose victims' rights. There'll be a lot of assets lost, and yet there's the promise of getting them to victims if we had access to more of the data. Maybe there's some kind of protocol that could be established with recognized experts in our field where we could, on some safe basis that satisfies your office, that we wouldn't abuse the privilege of going through some of that material to right some wrongs for some folks who are injured. I get emails every day. People, my husband had a heart attack last night because of the stress that the fraud has put on him. How many emails have I read in my 30 years in this field? Hundreds of emails of distress, of psychological pain, and of suffering. And on behalf of all those people, I say you have, I think, an obligation to explore how this can be resolved in some sensible way. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I mean, we actually read those emails in the Mossack Fonseca documents where you had victims pleading with them to basically reveal who the owners were of certain offshore companies that had been linked to frauds and other things. And some of the, I mean, it was quite heartbreaking, actually. My answer to that is the information is going to be presumably available out of Panama, that there are legal ways of getting this material. You don't need to come to us. I'll also make an overriding argument that the public pressure that comes from these kinds of stories actually institute change, and that it'll get rid of long-term the systemic problems and failures that you're having to experience and everyone's experiencing. And so basically, we're going to get laws changed as a result of this. This is probably, I would say, the best way of changing law, because you're putting the kind of public pressure, you're embarrassing people, you're showing what's gone wrong. And so long-term, I think we're going to benefit the very victims that you're talking about. But I think the problem you're going to have too is that if you need to get the material legally, and as the lawyers in the room are saying, there might be an issue with this particular material if no one knows where it's coming from. But whereas if you can, get it from Panama through the Panamanian authorities, and it is available, as I understand it, then that is a smarter way to do it.
Good luck. Good luck.
Mr. McKinney, as of right now, there's 3 people that have the data. GERARD's company has it, the German journalists have it, and the original source has it. If the original source is that so concerned with criminal matters and making things right, then maybe a request should be made through the German journalist to have a new copy from the source provided to lawyers that can assist the victims, whether it be some type of consortium or something. If that is he or she's ultimate goal, I'm with you. Once he's done, if he says, I'm done tomorrow, I published everything I'm going to publish, what's the harm of giving it to somebody that can help out?
Could I issue you a subpoena for those records? Are you a judge? Yes, could I have a judge?
I actually don't know. I'm not a lawyer, so I have no idea. Yeah.
I have a question for you. If you have a regime which is antisocial and aggressive with its foreign policy, perhaps they're subject to sanctions, and they set up a law firm with a specific intention of attracting wealth from political and influential figures, with the intention of gaining leverage in the world where perhaps they shouldn't have it, or, you know, in the case of extremist states, they definitely shouldn't have it. To what extent is that a national security concern?
I'm sorry, I don't fully understand. So
well, if you have a law firm which is sponsored by a rogue state, and that law firm is routinely setting up offshore structures for the political elite, the financial elite, whoever it may be, all of a sudden they have essentially a portfolio that they could use for blackmail purposes to gain leverage over United Nations and over, you know, it strikes me that it's actually quite a worrying thing that these institutions are not themselves vetted before they're able to provide these services. Of course, I'm just wondering to what extent that's considered to be a national security problem.
Yeah, I think it's got a real, I mean, the offshore world has national security issues. I mean, what we found is that Mossack Fonseca did not know who the clients were. I mean, that was their first answer to our questions. We don't have, none of these people you're asking us about are our clients, quote unquote. And it turned out to be true because it was basically the clients were of intermediaries such as banks. And there was no obligation on Mossack Fonseca, at least not until I think last year, to actually know who the end user was. So when you have secrecy, you have the potential for wrongdoing, and that's always been my motto on this. So yeah, I think you make a good point. I mean, I think there has to be very clear rules, and I think the rules in the offshore world are not clear, and they're a mishmash of new rules that keep coming in all the time. One of the other things that we saw in there was when organizations like the OECD or the European Union tried to crack down on, say, tax evasion, what we found was that this company got even just better at basically of getting around the rules.
Sure, just to correct the record, half the companies you're displaying information on, half of them are British Virgin Island companies. And Mossack Fonseca, BVI, have had to know their customer for many years, not just 1 year, many, many years.
They didn't know their customers in the BVI. In fact, there was a number of internal reports that we found inside the documents where Mossack Fonseca admitted internally that they did not know who the clients were.
Well, they were supposed to have access to it, at least from the head office or the office that was instructing them, and have an agreement to call it in. So if we have a court order in the BVI or a request for judicial assistance or a criminal investigation in the BVI, they're supposed to turn it over by being able to collect it quickly from their head office in Panama, or whoever's instructing them to form the company. And I appreciate that on at least 3 occasions I've served disclosure orders in them, and they weren't able to produce the data for some strange reason.
Yeah, there was email after email where they themselves were panicking internally, not knowing who the client was. In fact, they were fined, I think, by the BVI most recently, I think a year or two ago, for not knowing who the clients were. The system doesn't work. I mean, that seems to be clear from the data.
But in 90% of the cases I've executed disclosure orders in the BVI, we do get the ultimate beneficial ownership data. In my experience, we're dealing with an anomaly, a cultural anomaly locked in 1977 that never got out of the cowboy days of the offshore world. That's Mossack Fonseca. But the other trust companies I deal with, 90% of the occasions I hit them with an order, they comply quickly.
Mr. Riles, may I?
Sure.
I heard you say that you weren't, well, I guess I'm a little bit concerned that you don't seem concerned by the fact that you represent that you don't know how the anonymous source obtained the information. I mean, that's concerning from an ethical and a moral standpoint. I mean, it could be, and you say you're not a lawyer, but I think these sorts of obligations transcend one's occupation. I don't think journalists are exempt from, basic moral investigative inquiry. It could be the case that extortion, blackmail, other egregious criminal acts were used to obtain the data. And again, I guess it's a question, are you concerned that those sorts of criminal acts could have been used to obtain the data? And if they were, second question, you're saying public interest trumps that and that sanitizes those potentially illegal acts?
What I'm saying is I don't know, and so I can't really answer the question. I don't know how the material was taken. Well, I did inquire of the German journalist who inquired from the source. Again, I've got no answer. I'm sorry. I don't know how it... I mean, our obligation as journalists is to go outside the data to make sure that this is of public interest and to make sure that the material is genuine.
In the United States, we have a doctrine called willful blindness. It's actually a jury instruction in criminal cases. I mean, that's just willfully blind. That avoids moral responsibility. It sounds like you're layering offshore entities in a sense analogous to what you're criticizing.
Well, again, you're entitled to your opinion, yes. But
Agreed.
It is an opinion. I mean, we didn't break any laws.
Yeah. Gerard? Yeah. Hi, nice to see you again, Brad Birkenfeld. It's an interesting conversation with respect to the ethics and so forth of getting these documents released and so forth, and it's a difficult task on your side as well as some of the legal questions that are being asked here. But if you just turn the clock back a little bit from what I did as a whistleblower at UBS, handing the Department of Justice 19,000 accounts. These are actually direct bank accounts, as you rightly pointed out. And the Department of Justice is criminally corrupt here. They were part of the cover-up. So quite frankly, have we seen any indictments? We've seen maybe about 100 out of 19,000. 25% of the names were retrieved, 4,700. Why 4,700? Why not all 19,000? Then the IRS amnesty programs, 1, 2, and 3, were very successful, and that was a good thing. But the problem here is that why wasn't this done properly? Why was it covered up? And this is a big, big problem, and I think exposing things, if you expose the largest bank in the world with the largest number of American accounts, and you don't get to see them, then who in this room is ever going to trust the justice system? That's number one. Number two, you did uncover HSBC, and that was a very good piece. But then again, the sitting Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, has done nothing with that data that she was given as the U.S. Attorney in New York years ago. So I think a follow-up article by your group should certainly be pointed at, number one, the Department of Justice. Why have you done what you've done? I mean, you've robbed the American people, as well as the world for that matter, because that would have led to other investigations in other countries that would have said, this is what they're doing. The French government are now going after UBS, harder than the US government. So why are people sitting here and saying, oh, well, this is a problem and so forth? The problem rests right here in Washington, D.C. That's the problem. And I think you got to ask, with HSBC, what have they done? I mean, $20 million fine in Switzerland after all the information you exposed, and that's it. So I think there's a big disconnect here with respect to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would argue that that's why you need journalists to be, to be separate from the legal system, so that we can also bring pressure from, big public pressure for this kind of material. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of every case, so it's hard for me to comment on, but I'll give you an example that I guess brought it home to me. When we did the original OffshoreAlert material, basically this was material that I had managed to get a hold of from two companies called Portcullis TrustNet and Commonwealth. After we published, the day we published, 3 IRS agents turned up at our door at the Center for Public Integrity and basically were trying to subpoena the information from us. And they said, I don't remember saying basically, and we're the nice guys, basically, the two guys, and so basically Department of Justice and Homeland Security were following basically with subpoenas. And that really confused me, because at that point I knew that the IRS had the material and had the material for nearly 2 years and had done nothing with it. And then very quietly, about a month later, the IRS issued a press release, and the Australian Tax Office issued a press release, and the British Tax Office issued a press release saying that they were following the material. You know why? Because they had it all along and they didn't do anything with it. They weren't as motivated, I think, anyway. And again, I'm talking purely from a journalist's point of view, viewpoint. We were much more motivated to get to the bottom of what was in that material than the 3 tax offices that had the material and were sitting on it. Why? I don't know why. That's a question I never ask. Yeah. Well, I think, yeah.
As well as the UBS case. A couple of people have asked, where are the American names? I gave them the largest number of names in the world, and nothing was done with them. I mean, this is absolutely ludicrous. So when you say, oh, well, we got all these amnesty programs, and those are great programs. They worked very well. People came in and paid. But people who pay their taxes are saying, wait a minute, you just write a check and walk away?
Yeah.
So what's wrong with this system? That there's something wrong with that. And I've had a lot of people come up to me and say, I think these names should be exposed. Well, quite frankly, in my book, I'll be exposing some of those names. And I think it's important because it's going to show that the DOJ are frauds. I gave them names. All the names I gave them, not one person was indicted. Not one. Yeah. I mean, this is criminal.
Well, again, I think it's why you have to have different arms of society, basically, asking questions. The lawyers, you know, as well as the journalists and whistleblowers and other people, basically.
Oh, one more over here.
I'll soften my tone. And this is a legitimate question. I'm not trying to be accusatory, but you said that you've done nothing wrong. In most countries, receiving stolen goods is a crime. And despite the fact that you might not know it's extortion or whatever, I think it's fairly clear that you will have known that it was stolen data. Did you, I mean, are you concerned about that? I don't say this with any, you know, accusatory thing, but seems to me just logical as a lawyer that that is something where you might be exposed. I don't know.
Well, you're asking whether I'm concerned. Yes, I was concerned. I was concerned enough to go to our lawyer and ask him whether he could use it. But after that, you know, for me, public interest trumped everything else once we were allowed, under the law of the US, to use this material. I mean, you know, we had obligations to go outside the material to make sure it was real. I was very conscious of that, don't get me wrong. I mean, I spent months and months and months, and we had a lot of person hours going into making sure that this material was accurate. Because the last thing we wanted to do was find out it wasn't accurate, or that some of the material was accurate and the rest of it wasn't. But, you know, the facts are the facts. This material is accurate.
Okay, I think we'll wrap it up there. We're actually having a London conference on November the 14th and the 15th, and I'm going to invite the German journalist to participate in that. I'll certainly invite him. So I want to thank you all for coming. So our next conference is in London, November the 14th and the 15th, and our next Miami conference is April the 30th to May the 2nd. And thank you for enduring some of the disruptions that we've had. I appreciate every single one of you coming here and supporting the event. And we try to not only provide educational sessions, but also sessions that are entertaining. So thank you very much and have a safe trip home.